We all know that energy bills are going through the roof. And we also know what the two parties have proposed to do about it. Probable future Prime Minister Liz Truss has promised to cut April's national insurance rise, saving poorer houses 79p. And Labour leader Keir Starmer has pledged to freeze the energy cap at April's rate. That's just under £2,000 per year. To achieve that, he'd compensate the energy retailers to the tune of £29 billion. What do the public want? Opinium have carried out a survey asking respondents whether they supported the temporary nationalisation of energy firms if bills aren't lowered, and the results are overwhelming. Across all voters, 73% said they did support temporary renationalisation. And here's the result Liz Truss should be paying attention to. 72% of Conservative voters said they were in favour of it too.
This is really stunning data. It really goes against the grain of so much that we've been told about nationalisation, which is that it's this old-fashioned, extreme fantasy position of, a fanatical minority, basically. Obviously, as is often the case with right-wing projection, it's the complete opposite. Nationalisation, especially right now, bringing especially our basic needs into public ownership, is a very moderate and reasonable and sensible response to the crisis that we are in. We are in a cost of living crisis, and our basic needs are in the hands of companies whose sole reason for existing is to make as much money for their shareholders and execs as possible. That's not like a moral failure on the part of these companies. It's like an algorithm. Like if you put in a certain amount of code, it's going to repeatedly try and spit out a particular action to that. So the idea that those basic needs need to be taken back from those companies and in the hands of institutions whose sole function should be to make sure that everyone has access to those needs, that is a very reasonable position. What is extreme? What is a fantasist position that is being pushed only by a very committed and fanatical minority is the idea that after a decade of austerity, stagnant wages, a gutted social safety net, that we can somehow expect workers to pay 3 times their regular bills without any adequate support. Where do you expect people to find that money? Down the back of the sofa? I don't understand where the logical reasoning comes from for that. And so I wonder if that is what is behind this sort of more groundswell of support for renationalisation. And I also do think that this is a lot to do with what we saw in the pandemic. I think the pandemic really dispelled a lot of myths about the public sector versus the private sector. It really pierced through this idea that the public sector is inefficient, it's costly, it's bureaucratic, it's wasteful, versus the private sector, which is efficient, cost effective, and has like a trickle down economic effect. Well, in the pandemic, we saw huge amounts of money being poured into the private sector to solve, not super simple problems, but problems that are solvable. And we saw them essentially waste that public money in a way that hasn't even been accounted for properly. We saw that the government is perfectly happy to spend, that this idea that public spending is something that the Conservative government is reluctant to do. We saw that that was dispelled because they were more than happy to give away vast swathes of money to companies that had, political relationships and social relationships to Tory MPs. And we also saw that actually the one part of the COVID response that was actually world leading, which was the vaccine rollout, was actually conducted by the public sector. So that binary of the, inefficient, wasteful, failing public sector and the efficient and cost-effective and beneficial private sector really got tested in really stark terms for a lot of people. And so I wonder if that's also a driving force between people starting to actually really rethink this kind of myth that we have been told since the 1970s.
I think as you've touched upon there, Dahlia, Britain's privatisation woes are not just related to energy companies. Water firms are pumping our rivers and beaches full of sewage and wasting 2.4 billion litres of water every day. That's through leaking underground pipes. And all this is while the privatised rail companies and Royal Mail have pissed off their staff so much they're all going on strike. It's no wonder then that the public want a pretty radical change. Asked by Salvation whether various key services should be in public or private hands, overwhelming majority supported nationalisation. Across water, energy, mail and rail, nearly 70% were in favour, with 65% in favour of nationalising the buses. 78% wanted to keep the NHS in public hands. Keir Starmer, if you're watching, this probably should provide a political opportunity for anyone willing to actually argue for radical change. Now, you can't keep saying, oh, I would argue for nationalisation, but the most important thing is to win an election, when the electorate want you to argue for nationalisation. What's going on there?